Hey, it's Tech. Welcome to Off the Cuff. Let me see if this scenario sounds familiar. You go and you buy the latest top of the line tablet to go and replace your laptop that's 4 or 5 years old. And you bring it home and you're doing things, and this tablet just does not feel as fast as my laptop does, my 5-year-old laptop does. Or maybe you go to the store to buy a computer and you're looking at Core i5 and Pentium and AMDs and ARMs, and all they're telling you about is how many cores and how fast each core is. That's what the gigahertz, by the way, is how many cycles per second are those cores running at. Each core, by the way, is like a miniaturized CPU. Then they all work together to add more power. So the more cores, the better. And you know that, that's good. And the higher the clock speed, the more work it can do, that's good. But for some reason, those specs don't seem to match our real world experience. For instance, my 5-year-old laptop has 4 cores that run at 2.2 gigahertz each. My 2-year-old phone has 4 cores that run at 2.27 gigahertz each, a marginal improvement. So theoretically, I should be getting better performance on my phone. But on my phone, everything feels sluggish. I try and open a game and it takes some time. I try and open a web page and it takes half a minute to a minute to render. I try and open up, some form of photo app and it takes minutes to try and get anywhere and to do the little changes that I'm trying to do. And yeah, you can make fun of my phone if you want, but this was top of the line when I bought it 2 years ago. So what gives? Is this my imagination, or is there something more at play? Well, I'm going to give you the spoiler version now. The short answer is it's not my imagination. In fact, I can quantify the difference using some tests and some knowledge that I have. And I can tell you that my laptop is 12 to 85 times more powerful than my phone. That's right, my 5-year-old laptop is 12 to 85 times more powerful than my phone. So how did I figure that out? Okay, so let's talk about computers. Clock cycles and cores, which is the measurement that you're normally given to look at a processor, are good for comparing processors within the same family. So it's good for comparing an i5 to another i5 of the same generation, or an i7 to another i7 of the same generation, an ARM processor in the phone to another ARM processor in another phone of the same generation, with higher clock speeds giving you better performance in those cases. Why does the generation matter? Why does the make and model matter? Well, not all cores do the same amount of work in each clock cycle. In fact, as generations progress, each new generation should be able to do more work in each clock cycle than the previous generation, more computational work. The best measurement that we have for this, that kind of ignores all of the marketing buzz and the keywords and this, that, and the other thing, is what's called a flop, or rather flops, which stands for floating point operations per second. Floating point operations are pretty intense on processors when you're doing a lot of them. They're some of the more complicated math that processors do, and by running a set of tests that push the performance, the floating point operations per second performance, up to the most that it can get, we're able to look across computers and see more or less what their average power is going to be. So how do I test this? How can you test this at home? Well, there's a program out there that is the benchmark for every computer if you want to use it. In fact, it was originally developed for supercomputers. The program is called LINPACK. It was developed in the 1970s and 80s, and the people who developed it wanted a way for testing different supercomputers and comparing how how the results, what the end results of their power would be, because you had people like Cray building supercomputers one way, you have people like IBM building supercomputers a different way, using different chips, different ways of building it. And how do you compare? It's like apples and oranges. Well, what you need to do is figure out a set of tests to do that gets rid of the differences in, or rather exposes the differences in power between different computer chips and chipsets. So what they did is they wrote this program called LinPack, and all it is a whole bunch of math, like really a lot of math, like 10, 20, 30,000 operations of math. That's all it is, right? And so this math is standardized. They're standardized sets of math, and what you do is you just run it on your computer, and the computer ends up being pushed to the maximum that it can be. So how quickly it can solve these equations, which are a known number of operations to solve, how quickly it gives you how many operations per second it can do. That value, the flops, is more important when measuring and comparing computer power than cores and clock cycles, though the two are partially related, and I'm going to get into how here in a minute. So what does that mean for me? Well, on my Mac can do, my 5-year-old Mac, remember, can do 52 gigaflops, or 52 billion floating point operations per second in double precision math, which is right now for most consumers and programs the most complicated things that they do. That's it, becomes its benchmarked maximum. So no program should be able to run faster than that. A lot will run more slowly than that because they're not doing just pure huge volumes of math that can be ridiculously parallel and run everywhere. My phone, on the other hand, okay, so remember, this is clocked faster, has the same number of cores. My phone can run 4.04 gigaflops total in single precision, which is a lot less intense than the double precision math that this does. And when I bump up the test to double precision, my phone only runs at 660 megaflops, or millions of floating point operations per second. So 52 billion floating point operations per second versus 660 million. That's a huge difference in power. So what gives? What the heck is going on? Why is my 5-year-old laptop so much faster than a really good quality phone today? All right. In order to understand what's going on, we have to look a little bit about how computer chips themselves work. So programs which we run, applications that we run, all they are is a series of instructions to computer chips on how to manage and evaluate data. What do you do with the information? How do you receive it? How do you transform it? How do you output it back to the user? So at the core heart of all computers and the computer chips are these instructions. One instruction, when it's executed, that is an operation. So instructions per second or operations per second are more or less synonymous. So I send these instructions to the CPU, and how long it takes the CPU to execute that instruction, how many clock cycles, gives me a value called the cycles per instruction. Now you'd think, if you don't know much about computers, that one cycle, one instruction. It's not quite like that. Here's the thing. Most instructions take around 3 to 5 steps to execute. RISC can be 1-to-1. CISC is almost always more than one cycle to execute. But more or less, you have multiple line items in that instructions. That it's like load this from the RAM, load that from the RAM, decode the instruction, execute that instruction right back to the register or to the RAM or wherever it's going. So you have these multiple steps in order to execute any given instruction, and each one of those steps takes time. Each one of those steps takes one clock cycle. So on average, there's usually about 3 to 5 or more stages for each instruction. It differs from what instruction it's running, but on average, it can be right around five operations, 5 little bits to each instruction. So you have 5 stages of execution. If you were to run all of these instructions on one core, one instruction at a time, it'd go through these average of 5 steps, and it would be going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cycles, one instruction executed, one operation. So you'd have a ratio of about 5 cycles for one operation. That's not very powerful. So what's really, really interesting is that my phone has clocked in at 4.04 gigaflops, which means it's exactly averaging 2 instructions per, or 2 cycles per instruction. So that's quite a lot of cycles per instruction. There's not much optimization going on. The huge advantage there is electrical power. By not stacking in a lot of parallelization into the core, by not putting in more parts of the core, it can run at low power. So there is some pipelining going on, but not much. So the first thing that we do, by the way, to improve the performance per core is to add a pipeline. A pipeline basically says, well, if it's taking me 5 steps to execute one set of instructions, what I can do, and each one of those is in a different part of the core, I can start this instruction. Then as it moves to the next part, I can start another instruction. And as they move down to the next part, I can start a third instruction, and a fourth, and a fifth, right? And so that the whole core is being used on every cycle. And what that does is it pushes up the ratio of operations per cycle to a 1-to-1 ratio. So you're basically effectively doing one operation in one cycle, and then you lose some for overhead. That's what's going on with the single precision there. On the double precision, it's adding more and more parts in order to be able to, this is a 32-bit processor, in order to be able to do the 64-bit math, it's adding multiple steps to it, and that just gives you a huge difference to run about 16 cycles, or 8 times slower than the single precision, which is running at 2 cycles per instruction. So we have the pipelining, that's the first step. Now the other thing that I could do is, rather than just having one execution unit, one set of these in places where it can run, maybe I could put in 2 for each core. Now, using the same pipelining technique, as it comes out at the end, rather than doing one operation per second or per cycle on average, I'm now doing 2 because I have 2 little execution units. That's something that's very, very common for desktops as well, is to double up the number of execution units that's going on. And my Mac has that going on. It has 2 execution units in each core that runs this math in parallel and in the pipeline. So those 2 things push it up to about 2 operations per cycle. Now, the next thing to do, which again you're going to do on a desktop or on a laptop, but not on a phone or a tablet, is you're going to add larger word sizes. So who says that I can only do one operation in each execution unit at a time? What if I take 4 bits of data, and if I'm doing the same operation on them, right? So let's say I'm adding, so I'm adding this to this. Why don't I do 4 of them at the same time? So this and this, this and this, this and this, this and this, all in the same set of time. Now, there's no reason not to. That's called increasing the word length, or the width. Sorry, not the length. So in the Intel architecture, what you're going to find in laptops or desktops, they have larger width entries into the execution unit. So the program, as it's going through the instructions that are coming down, the CPU says, okay, I can take this and this and this and put them all together and run them at the same time because it's all the same operation. And I can take this and this and this and take all of that and run them over here all at the same time, because they're all doing the same thing. So rather than having to run the same thing over and over and over and over again, it can run it once, right? So you get a 4x multiplier. On the most recent chips, it's actually an 8x multiplier. So you can do 8 simultaneous operations in each core or in each execution unit by increasing the width. So the catch here is, if I'm only doing one operation, I have the electrical power draw of the much wider ones through the whole system. And that becomes a problem when you're dealing with mobile technologies. With mobile technologies, the power draw is important. We have a limited size of battery. You're not plugging it in all the time. You're not running it from the wall. So its overall electrical power consumption becomes a big factor compared to the amount of work that it can do. The end result of all of this is that while my phone does 2 cycles per operation, my laptop does a quarter cycle per operation, even in double precision floating point, or rather an eighth, right? And so what happens is my floating point operations now, in each cycle, I'm getting 8 here and half of one there at the very best, a 16th of one at its worst, which is double precision math. And so you cross multiply and you come up with, depending on what type of work the computer is doing, the laptop is 12 to 85 times more powerful. That's a big difference. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to quickly address before I close today. One, this is not a difference between RISC chips and CISC chips. So reduced instruction set computing versus complete instruction set computing. It's not the difference there. A well-designed RISC chip can run as fast as a CISC chip. This is an architecture difference designed specifically to make sure that your phone and your tablet don't draw as much power. Second, there are a few other tweaks that Intel does and AMD do on their computer chips that help increase the amount of operations that can be done per cycle. But I don't want to get into them. They're also not quite as common, so we're not going to talk about them today. So let me know what your experience has been when you've been comparing computer chips and processors. Let me know your thoughts on gigahertz and cores in the comments below. If this is your first time visiting Tech Laboratories, go ahead and subscribe. And until next time, I'm Tech Adams saying keep thinking, and thanks for watching.